It was just after 7 o'clock in the evening when the Robinson family pulled into the downtown parking lot of Charlottesville, Virginia. The sun was beginning to dip behind the rolling Blue Ridge Mountains, casting golden streaks over the modest skyline of the town. Malik Robinson turned off the ignition of the family's aging silver minivan and glanced at his wife. Denise smiled back, adjusted her scrubs as she unbuckled her seatbelt. In the back seat, their two children, 8-year-old Maya and 5-year-old Jordan, were buzzing with excitement. They had heard about the new restaurant opening for weeks, the kind of place that served wood-fired pizzas and handmade desserts that sounded too fancy for their regular Friday dinners. "This is just dinner," Malik had said earlier, brushing off Denise's suggestion that he wear something nicer than his faded button-down shirt. "We deserve something simple after this week." And they did. Malik, a high school history teacher, had just wrapped up a grueling parent-teacher conference marathon. Denise, a nurse at the local hospital, had worked 3 overnight shifts. Between their jobs, bills, and the constant juggle of parenting, dinners like this were rare. This wasn't an anniversary or a birthday. It was just a moment of pause, a way to say we're still here, together. The restaurant, with its rustic sign and open-air patio, looked as charming as the photos. As they approached the entrance, Malik noticed the hostess, a young white woman, glancing at them, then looking quickly over her shoulder toward the interior. Her smile flickered for only a second before settling into a tense, almost rehearsed expression. "Good evening," she said. "Do you have a reservation?" "No, but we were hoping to get a table for 4, Malik replied with an easy smile, hoisting Jordan into his arms. The hostess hesitated. She looked past them toward the dining room, then back at Malik. "I'm sorry we're fully booked tonight." Malik blinked, his eyes naturally drifting through the large front windows. He could see at least 5 empty tables, 2 near the entrance and a few in the back. A couple was just being seated. Another table had just been cleared. "I see some open tables," Denise said, her voice calm but unmistakably pointed. The hostess shifted uncomfortably. "Those are reserved. We're very full tonight." Malik didn't say anything at first. He glanced at his wife, then at the kids. Maya had already picked up on the tension. Jordan, sensing his father's stillness, wrapped his arms more tightly around his neck. A muscle in Malik's jaw tightened as he nodded slowly. "All right," he said, voice even. "Thanks anyway." He turned, placing a hand gently on Denise's lower back to guide her away. Her eyes were fixed on the hostess, but she didn't say a word. Malik could feel his daughter's small hand slip into his, warm and unsure. They stepped out onto the sidewalk, the buzz of laughter and clinking glasses echoing behind them. They walked in silence for a few seconds. Then Malik exhaled. He didn't look back. He didn't have to. Inside the restaurant, the hostess exhaled too. Across the room, the manager gave her a subtle nod. The moment passed, but not for everyone. Near the bar, a man in a navy blazer and rolled-up sleeves had watched the exchange closely. He wasn't staring, exactly, but there was a stiffness in his posture, a tension in the way he held his wine glass. His name was Christopher Hale, a partner at a local law firm. Christopher wasn't someone who sought out conflict. He believed in civility, in systems. He had grown up with structure, with an understanding that doing the right thing didn't always make you popular. But there was something about the way the Robinson family had been turned away. The quiet dignity in Malik's voice, the confusion on the children's faces. That made him sit up straighter. The restaurant noise returned, but his focus didn't. He had seen enough. He took one last sip of wine, placed the glass carefully on the table, and stood up. Outside, the Robinsons had paused at the corner. Malik was trying to hide the weight on his face, but Denise knew him too well. "I'm tired," she said softly, "but not just from work." Malik nodded. "Yeah." Maya tugged on her mom's sleeve. "Can we go somewhere else?" Denise was about to answer when Malik turned suddenly. Behind them, the restaurant door opened. Christopher Hale stepped onto the sidewalk, pulling a folded receipt from his wallet and slipping it into his jacket pocket. He walked toward them, his pace calm, his expression unreadable, but there was kindness in his eyes. "Excuse me," he said, slowing as he approached. "I hope I'm not intruding. I saw what happened inside. Malik narrowed his eyes slightly, protective instinct kicking in. "We're okay." "I believe you," Christopher said. "But I want to ask you something." Denise stepped closer to her husband, watching the man carefully. Christopher's voice lowered, steady and without a trace of performance. "That place," he said, tilting his head toward the restaurant, "won't see another dollar from me. I close my tab and cancel my membership." Malik's brows furrowed. "Why?" Christopher shrugged lightly. "Because silence feels a lot like permission, and I don't give mine to that." There was a pause. Malik didn't respond immediately. Behind him, Maya looked up at the tall man, eyes curious. Jordan yawned into his father's shoulder. "I know a place," Christopher continued. 5 minutes away. Family-owned. Great food, and they'd be lucky to have you." Denise's hand slid into Malik's. The air was still warm, but something about the evening had shifted. Malik looked at his wife, then at his children, and finally back at the stranger. "What's your name?" he asked. "Christopher." Another pause. Malik let out a quiet breath. "Okay, Christopher," he said. "Lead the way." They walked in silence, the 5 of them, Christopher slightly ahead as if clearing the path to the warm, heavy air of the Virginia evening. The children had grown quiet, lulled by the rhythm of their parents' footsteps and the unfamiliarity of the moment. Malik kept one arm around Denise and the other close to his son's hand. He didn't quite know what to make of this man, this stranger who had stepped out from the comfort of his dinner to approach them. But something in the way Christopher carried himself, calm, confident without arrogance, made it hard to dismiss him. There was no grand performance, no apology offered on behalf of a world that often pretended to be more evolved than it was. Just presence, just action. They turned the corner, and Christopher slowed his pace. "It's right up here," he said, gesturing to a small side street lined with low brick buildings. "Laurel's Kitchen. Not flashy, but the food is incredible, and I promise they won't turn you away." The storefront was modest, its windows glowing with soft light. There was no line, no crowd, just a low murmur of conversation filtering through the walls and the scent of something rich and savory wafting into the street. Christopher held the door for the family. As they stepped inside, the contrast was immediate. The hostess, an older woman with gray-streaked curls and a bright blue scarf around her neck, greeted them with a warmth that was unmistakably genuine. "Good evening," she said, eyes flicking briefly between Malik, Denise, and the kids before landing on Christopher. "Back again so soon?" Christopher chuckled lightly. "Couldn't stay away. Table for 5? She nodded, already grabbing menus. "Of course. Right this way." The dining room was cozy, the kind of place built more for comfort than impression. Malik noticed the art on the walls, local paintings, some clearly done by children. There was no pretense here, no performance. Just a restaurant serving food and people. They settled into a corner booth near a window. Christopher took the seat closest to the aisle, giving the family space. The kids slid in beside each other, and the tension that had clung to the evening began to slip away, replaced by curiosity. Menus were passed around, water glasses filled. Denise helped Maya read to the options while Jordan pointed excitedly at the dessert section. Malik glanced at Christopher, who was studying the menu but not hiding his awareness of the family's discomfort. Malik leaned slightly forward. "So what made you get up?" he asked, voice quiet but direct. Christopher looked up and met his gaze. There was no pause, no defensiveness. "I've been sitting down too long," he said, "in more ways than one." Denise turned her attention from the menu, intrigued. "I was raised by a single mother," Christopher continued, voice steady. "She taught high school English. Worked 2 jobs most of the time. We didn't have much, but she made sure I understood that silence is never neutral." Malik nodded slowly. The words landed with weight, not because they were novel, but because they were true. "I didn't know what to say when it happened," Malik admitted. "Not to them, not even to my kids. I just wanted to leave without making a scene." "You shouldn't have to make a scene to be treated decently," Christopher replied. "But I get it. Sometimes walking away feels like the only safe option." Their server arrived, a young man with a wide smile and a quick laugh. Orders were taken, drinks poured, the atmosphere slowly softening around the edges. The kids began to giggle, Maya telling Christopher about her school project on Harriet Tubman, Jordan asking if pizza was a food group. Laughter rose from the table like steam, fragile at first, then genuine. Between bites of grilled chicken and roasted vegetables, conversation deepened. Christopher shared stories from his early days at law school, the professors who underestimated him because he'd gone to state college, the subtle slights he had learned to swallow. Denise talked about the patients she'd cared for, how bias often showed up in medical settings in ways people didn't like to admit. They spoke not as strangers anymore, but as people who had seen enough of the world's undercurrents to know when something was wrong. Malik, who had spent his adult life teaching students about systemic injustice, found himself feeling something unusual at the table, recognized. Not pitted, not explained away, but seen. And it unsettled him in a good way. People always talk about change like it's a speech or a protest or a law. Christopher said at one point, and those things matter, but sometimes it's just a choice. One moment. Denise nodded, swirling her drink. It's easy to scroll past a headline or shake your head, but getting up, that takes something. I didn't think, Christopher said. I just knew I couldn't sit there and pretend I didn't see what I saw. Malik leaned back in his seat, watching the man across from him. It wasn't about heroism, he realized. Christopher wasn't trying to be anything more than what he already was. Someone who'd simply decided he wouldn't be a bystander. The check arrived and Christopher insisted on covering the meal. Malik started to object, but Christopher raised a hand gently. Let me do this. Please. The Robinsons stood to leave, the kids now drowsy and content, their small hands sticky from dessert. Outside, the night air had cooled, a gentle breeze sweeping through the quiet street. They lingered near the corner, the goodbye hesitant. I really appreciate what you did, Malik said, offering his hand. Christopher took it. It was the least I could do. Denise stepped forward and hugged him, briefly but sincerely. I hope this isn't the last time we talk, she said. It won't be, Christopher replied. They exchanged numbers, the final gesture of strangers who were no longer strangers. As the Robinsons walked back toward their car, Malik glanced over his shoulder once. Christopher was still standing there, watching them go. No expectation, no pride, just presence. Later that night, long after the kids had been tucked into bed, Malik sat on the couch with his laptop open. He stared at the blinking cursor of a blank post, unsure how to begin. He wasn't trying to go viral. He didn't want sympathy. But something about the night, the cold refusal, the quiet resistance, the unexpected kindness, refused to let him sleep. So he began to type. The following morning arrived with a quiet kind of clarity. The Robinson home stirred gently as the sun crept into the kitchen window, casting long beams across the breakfast table. Malik had stayed up past midnight, the events of the previous evening still replaying in fragments through his mind. The hesitation in the hostess's eyes, the emptiness of those reserved tables, and the firm calmness with which Christopher Hale had walked away from it all. But more than anything, Malik couldn't stop thinking about the dinner that followed. Not the food, although it had been exceptional, but the connection, surprising, immediate, and disarming. He didn't know exactly what to name it yet, but it had lodged itself in his thoughts like a question waiting to be answered. Denise moved quietly through the house, checking on the kids, who were still deep in a fog of sleep. Malik sat at the kitchen table, nursing a warm cup of coffee and scrolling through his phone. He hadn't posted the message yet. The words were there, sitting in the draft folder, clear and composed, but he still felt unsure. Would it even matter? Would anyone care? The story was too familiar, too quiet, the kind people read with a sigh before moving on. But something about the encounter made him hesitate. For once, not out of fear or frustration, but from a sense of responsibility. By early afternoon, he hit post. He didn't use hashtags. He didn't name the restaurant. He didn't even mention Christopher by name. The story was told plainly, with the same tone he used in the classroom when trying to explain complex realities to skeptical teenagers. He wrote about how he had taken his family out for a simple dinner, how they were turned away with manufactured politeness, and how a stranger had stood up, left his meal behind, and invited them to a different table. He ended the post not with outrage, but with a reflection. "Kindness doesn't erase injustice," he wrote, "but it interrupts it. And sometimes that interruption is all it takes to remind us we are not invisible." By the time dinner rolled around, Malik's phone wouldn't stop vibrating. Friends from college, colleagues from school, distant cousins, and even former students have flooded his inbox with messages of support, anger, gratitude, and resonance. The post had caught a wave. People shared it, quietly at first, then rapidly, until hundreds of comments began stacking under his original words. Stories of similar moments poured in. Some were worse. Some were eerily alike. Many came from parents who admitted they didn't know how to talk about these things with their children until they read what he'd written. Denise read through the comments as she prepared sandwiches for kids. She said nothing at first, just watched the growing conversation unfold with a mixture of sadness and awe. Then, without looking up, she said, "You did the right thing, you know." Malik nodded. "It doesn't fix anything, but it's something." Meanwhile, across town, Christopher sat in his small office at home, flipping through legal briefs when his phone buzzed. He had received a message from a colleague, someone he hadn't spoken to in months, with a link to Malik's post and the words, "Is this about you?" He clicked the link and read the story slowly. His name wasn't mentioned. The description was vague enough to shield identities, but the moment was unmistakable. He read it twice, then leaned back in his chair, processing the wave of emotions that swelled beneath the surface. He hadn't expected anything to come of what he did. He hadn't even seen it as an act of significance, just a line he couldn't cross, a moment he chose not to ignore. But now it was public, and though his name wasn't there, the memory of that family, of Malik's quiet disappointment, and Denise's poised silence, of those two children standing beneath the weight of something they didn't yet fully understand, that memory resurfaced with vivid clarity. The following day, Malik received a text from Christopher. Saw the post. "You told it well. If you and Denise ever want to grab coffee, let me know." Malik smiled at the message and showed it to his wife. She simply replied, "You should go." 3 days later, Malik met Christopher at a coffee shop near the university. It was late morning, the space half full with students and freelancers typing away on laptops. They sat near the back, away from the windows, sipping black coffee and letting the silence hang comfortably between them. "You didn't have to write about it," Christopher said eventually. "I didn't plan to," Malik replied. "But I couldn't let it just pass, either." "I get it." They spoke for nearly 2 hours. About race, yes, but also about children and work and exhaustion. Christopher opened up more than he had during dinner. He spoke about the isolation he sometimes felt in his profession, about growing up without a father, and about how his mother had taught him that fairness was only real if you were willing to share it with others. Malik listened, absorbing it all, nodding, asking questions. He spoke about the things the students shared in private, the weight of being both teacher and role model, and the moments when he felt he was speaking into a void. "Most of the time, I'm not even angry anymore," Malik said. "Just tired." Christopher looked at him. "That's the part people don't understand. Fatigue. It builds." "And you?" Malik asked, "What made you stop that night?" "Really?" Christopher paused. "I think I saw my mother and your wife, and I saw myself in your kids. I couldn't be silent and still live with myself." There was a long moment of stillness between them. No grand conclusion, no dramatic breakthrough, just understanding. When they finally stood to leave, Christopher reached into his coat pocket and handed Malik a folded card. "What's this?" Malik asked. "Just something I've been working on. An idea for a nonprofit. I've been thinking about doing something real with it, but I haven't had the right people to talk to. Until now." Malik unfolded the card. The logo was rough, handwritten, a tree with deep roots and open branches. Beneath it, the words, "The Quiet Stand Foundation." He looked up at Christopher. "You serious about this?" "I wouldn't have given you the card if I wasn't." Malik smiled. "Let's see where it goes." They shook hands again, firmer this time, with a sense of purpose forming silently between them. Neither of them could have known just how far that idea would travel. The momentum of Malik's post did not slow. Within 48 hours, it spread beyond the borders of Charlottesville. reaching readers in neighboring counties and then states. The local news picked up the story after a university professor reshared the post and included a brief thread analyzing racial bias in service industries. Soon, the headline appeared on a community news segment. Family denied at local restaurant. Strangers step in with grace and action. That framing alone stripped the spectacle and focused instead on the human exchange, sparked a different kind of conversation, not one driven by outrage, but by a need for reflection. At Jefferson High, where Malik taught 11th grade U.S. history, the school atmosphere shifted perceptibly. Students who usually breeze into class with headphones in and their heads down now paused to speak to him. One white student, timid and clearly nervous, stayed after class and said, "Mr. Robinson, my dad shared your post with me. I just want to say I'm sorry that happened to your family. And thank you for saying something." Malik didn't offer a lecture in response. He only said, "Thank you for reading it." He understood the value of discomfort. It was a teacher's constant companion, and he welcomed it now more than ever. Meanwhile, the restaurant at the center of the story finally responded, belatedly and with unmistakable corporate polish. A brief message was posted on its social media account. "We are aware of the incident and are reviewing our staff conduct protocols. We apologize for any unintentional offense and reaffirm our commitment to inclusivity." It was a kind of apology crafted not from genuine regret, but from damage control. The comments beneath it made that clear. People called it hollow, demanded accountability, and shared their own troubling experiences. Former employees chimed in, some anonymously, confirming that the behavior was not a one-time oversight. The restaurant's Yelp page filled with one-star reviews overnight. And while some voices dismissed the backlash as an overreaction, others made a different point. That silence is no longer an option, not even in small towns. Christopher, for his part, kept his head low. He responded to a few messages from friends who had figured out it was him in the story, but he refused interviews and avoided online threads. When a local journalist emailed asking for a statement, he simply replied, "I didn't do anything newsworthy. I just stood up, that's all." But something had shifted inside him since that night. He found himself waking early, taking long walks through his neighborhood, turning over ideas that had long sat dormant. The card he had given Malik, the one with a hand-drawn tree, and the words "A Quiet Stand Foundation," wasn't just a sketch anymore. He had begun drafting bylaws, researching nonprofit regulations, and pulling together names of people who might help shape it. A week after their coffee meeting, Malik and Christopher sat down in the conference room of Christopher's firm during off hours, with a whiteboard, a laptop, and a shared sense that something new was being built, not just in response to one injustice, but as a proactive answer to many. They envisioned a program that could educate, support, and amplify voices in small communities where issues like implicit bias, racial profiling, and workplace discrimination often went unspoken. They weren't interested in viral fame. They wanted structure, mentorship programs for students, sensitivity workshops for small businesses, legal assistance for those afraid to speak up. It was ambitious, yes, but it felt necessary. Denise joined them during the planning stages, offering insights from her experience in healthcare. She spoke about patients misdiagnosed or ignored, about colleagues who spoke over her in meetings, and about how the most dangerous part of discrimination was often its subtlety. "It's not always about who gets turned away at the door," she said one evening, seated across from Christopher at her kitchen table. "Sometimes it's who never gets called back, who's constantly doubted, who has to work twice as hard to be taken half as seriously." Her words helped shape the foundation's mission statement, which Christopher later typed out and pinned on his office wall. To interrupt injustice where it's quietest and to teach others how to do the same. In the background, Malik's post continued to circulate. It was translated into 3 languages and featured in an online education journal. A high school in North Carolina invited him to speak via video call. Then a youth mentorship organization in Chicago reached out, asking if he would consider expanding his program there. Malik was stunned, but not flattered. He was sobered. He realized how rare it was for Black families like his to be heard not in crisis, but in reflection. One evening, after the kids were asleep, Malik and Denise sat on the porch. The sky above them streaked with stars. They talked about the days ahead, about whether they could really commit to launching a nonprofit while still holding down their full-time jobs and raising 2 children. They didn't come to a firm decision that night, but they agreed on one thing. They couldn't go back to how things were. Not after everything. The next morning, a plain white envelope arrived at their door, addressed only to the Robinson family. No return address. No postage stamp. Inside was a single page of handwritten text, folded carefully. Malik opened it slowly, scanning the unfamiliar handwriting. Denise leaned in, watching his face as he read. The letter came from someone they had not expected, a former waiter at the restaurant that had turned them away. He hadn't spoken up that night. He hadn't intervened, but he had seen everything, and he had not forgotten it. I was working that night. I didn't agree with what happened, but I froze. I told myself it wasn't my decision, that it wasn't my place. But watching that man get up and walk out, that's what stuck with me. I realized how often I'd chosen comfort over courage. I resigned the next day. I've decided to apply for jobs in social work. I want to do something that helps, even in small ways. I don't expect a response. I just want to say thank you for what you didn't know you were doing. The letter ended without a name. Malik folded it slowly, his hands trembling just slightly. Denise reached for it, read it, then placed it on the table as if it were something sacred. Neither of them spoke right away. They didn't need to, because in that moment, they understood something deeper than all the articles and comments and speeches. The story had shifted. What began as exclusion had become a mirror, and in that reflection, people were seeing themselves more clearly. Not just the wronged, but the bystanders. The ones who'd stayed silent. The ones who now realized silence was no longer an option. The noise around the original incident had faded somewhat. Social media attention always moved on. But something else had taken root, quiet and strong, like the branches of trees spreading underground before it ever broke the surface. They would water it. They would keep going. And neither of them would forget the night it all began. Not with a refusal, but with someone standing up and walking out. The letter changed something in Malik, something he couldn't yet articulate. It wasn't just the words or the resignation of a waiter he had never met. It was a quiet courage stitched in the fabric of that anonymous apology, the kind of personal reckoning that rarely found its way into public spaces. That message was not about guilt. It was about transformation. And from Malik, it confirmed what he had started to suspect. That change, when it came, wouldn't always look like a protest or a headline. Sometimes it arrived in envelopes, and signed and deeply sincere. Later that week, Malik printed the letter and placed it in a thin, clear sleeve inside a folder labeled Quiet Stories. It was a label he and Christopher had begun using for the Foundation's newest initiative, a digital archive of anonymous reflections from individuals who had chosen to confront their own silence, complicity, or awakening. The idea had grown quickly after Malik casually mentioned it during a community panel. Now, people from across the country were sending in messages, some handwritten, others typed, but all describing moments when they had seen injustice and either turned away or, inspired by someone else's courage, chosen not to. In Charlottesville, the project had begun to take physical shape. A community center had offered a small office for the foundation to operate from on weekends. Volunteers signed up to assist with outreach and administrative tasks. A local print shop offered discounted services to help them produce flyers, posters, and educational packets. And on the last Sunday of the month, the Robinsons, along with Christopher and a growing network of supporters, hosted their first open workshop, a 2-hour session titled Interruptions: How to Speak When It's Easier to Stay Quiet. The event exceeded expectations. More than 50 people attended, some teachers, some small business owners, a few teenagers, and even a retired couple who had driven in from 2 towns over after seeing Malik's story shared by their granddaughter. Denise led the group through real-life scenarios, drawing from her hospital experience, while Christopher broke down common legal misconceptions about workplace discrimination. Malik, as always, focused on context, on the history of silence and the ripple effects of what he called everyday resistance. What struck them most was how many people stayed afterward, not to argue, but to talk. Conversations broke out in every corner of the room. Some participants share moments they have been carrying for years. One man in his 60s confessed that he had once kept quiet when his coworker made a racist joke in front of a new black employee. He'd laughed awkwardly, then avoided eye contact for weeks. "I thought it would blow over," he said quietly, "but now I see I let it stay." He didn't cry, but his voice cracked. No one judged him. That wasn't the point. The room simply listened. That night, back at home, Malik sat on the couch, arms around his son Jordan, who had fallen asleep during a movie. Denise sat at the dining table, helping Maya with a school project. The atmosphere was calm, but Malik's mind was turning. He had received another message earlier that day, one he hadn't yet shared with his family. The email was from a former waiter, the same one who had sent the anonymous letter. This time, he had signed it. His name was Brandon. He had seen the post about the workshop and decided he wanted to meet in person, if Malik was open to it. The message was thoughtful, respectful, and careful not to impose. Malik read it twice before responding. He said yes. They agreed to meet at Laurel's Kitchen, the same restaurant where Christopher had first taken the Robinsons that night. When Malik arrived, Brandon was already seated at a small table by the window. He stood when Malik approached, clearly nervous but steady. He was young, mid-20s, with a soft face and the kind of expression that looked like it had been shaped by too many apologies he'd never spoken aloud. "Thank you for meeting me," Brandon said. Malik shook his hand. "You didn't have to write that letter, but I'm glad you did." They sat down, ordered coffee, and talked for nearly an hour. Brandon shared that he had worked at the original restaurant for nearly 2 years. It was his first steady job after college. He hadn't noticed the patterns at first. The passive discrimination, the way certain guests were seated faster, treated better, offered special menus. But once he began to notice, he couldn't stop. And when the Robinsons walked in that night, he said something about the way the manager responded made him feel sick. He knew it was wrong, and yet he said nothing. "I went home and just sat there. I couldn't sleep. And then I saw your post the next day," Brandon said. "I kept thinking. I saw it happen, but I didn't do what Christopher did. I didn't even do the bare minimum." Malik didn't rush to comfort him. He didn't absolve him, but he did say, "You did something afterward. That matters." Brandon nodded, tears in his eyes now. "I want to help, however I can." In the weeks that followed, Brandon became one of the most active volunteers at the Quiet Stand Foundation. He helped build the digital archive, organize the storytelling events, and even offered to co-facilitate workshops for service workers. His presence was quiet, but his dedication was unmistakable. He didn't speak of redemption, only of responsibility. By early autumn, the foundation had grown beyond Charlottesville. A grant from a regional nonprofit gave them enough funding to expand their programming into neighboring counties. Malik and Denise were both balancing their professional lives with their new commitments, but somehow the exhaustion felt different now. Heavier in the body, perhaps, but lighter in the soul. There was purpose in every conversation, every letter, every person who walked into a session unsure and left just a bit more awake. One afternoon, as Malik prepared to leave his classroom, he noticed an envelope tucked into his mailbox at school. It wasn't addressed. Inside, there was a single sheet of paper, torn from a student's notebook. The handwriting was messy, rushed. It read, "I was in the restaurant that night. My dad was the manager. I didn't say anything then. I was scared he'd lose his job. But I read your post. I saw how many people it reached. And I started to think about how I want to show up in the world. I'm sorry, and I'm learning." Malik read the note twice, then slid it into his folder beside Brandon's letter. It didn't matter who had written it. What mattered was that it existed. As autumn deepened, Malik and Denise stood at the front of another workshop, this time held at the local library. They looked out over a crowd that was no longer surprising in its size. Christopher stood near the back, arms crossed, watching with quiet pride. Brandon passed out pamphlets near the entrance. Maya and Jordan played with coloring books in the corner. The air felt different now, not because the world had changed, but because someone had stood up and others followed. It hadn't begun with a protest. It had begun when one man decided he wouldn't finish his dinner. And in that small interruption, a movement had taken root.